My name is Olin Schumacher. I live in Ripton, a small town in central Vermont. Just east of us is Lake Champlain, and on the opposite shore is the International Paper Mill. On February 1st, 2005, International Paper filed for a permit to burn 72 tons of shredded tires as 10% of their fuel source. I received a notice in the mail from a group who was trying to raise awareness of Vermonters. They were letting people know about the permit that was filed by International Paper and what health problems it could cause to the people of Vermont. It explained that emissions from burning these tires, even as only 10% of the fuel, could increase emissions in all sorts of chemicals, causing problems for both our environment and for the people around the paper mill. The 2-week test burn in February was delayed because the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York said that the permit was incomplete.
My information is that I forgot the year, but a few years ago they did a short burn, not very high concentrations or volumes. I don't believe they got a permit for that. When the proposal first came out, I think the IP wanted to at least do the test burn without having to get approval from their regulators in New York. Yeah. And so one of the big things that's happened is that the New York Department of Environmental Conservation said that they really need to submit an application and get approval before they even test burn the tires.
So as required by the state, International Paper submitted an application. This guaranteed that the emissions coming out of Ticonderoga were monitored.
They sent it back to them, and IP revised some of their modeling assumptions. Then, as you pointed out, when they submitted it you said January, I'll trust your date, New York Department of Environmental Conservation said it's not complete. There's a bunch of things you haven't addressed. Right.
I decided to take a short trip to Shoreham, Vermont, across the lake from International Paper. I was amazed by the amount of smoke that seemed to be coming out of International Paper's plant. I decided to find out more about the emissions from burning tires and the effects on health and wildlife. So I decided to ask my grandfather, James Fay, the director of the Union of Concerned Scientists and professor of mechanical engineering at MIT, whose recent studies have concentrated on air, water, and pollution problems.
Well, in my research at MIT, I've worked on air pollution as a major research interest, and that dates way back to the early 1970s when I was doing laboratory research on that. But I'm very familiar with aspects of looking at how emissions from sources can provide harmful chemicals in the environment that people breathe. So that the objective of improving people's health by reducing emissions, that's a common theme on all national and state programs for the last 30 to 40 years. And it's a very important thing that we continue to make sure that harmful emissions get reduced so that the effects on public health diminish.
I think there were some omissions in some areas of the application which the technical people at the New York department found needed more work.
In 1925, International Paper purchased a mill built in 1882 on the banks of the Lachute River in the village of Ticonderoga. In 1970, the new mill was built several miles north of Ticonderoga on the shores of Lake Champlain. Every day, workers from International Paper walk down this hallway. This sign lets them know if there has been any accidents in the last 24 hours. Even though International Paper has very few accidents per year, the flashing red light will alert anyone who's coming down this hallway that there has been an accident. I learned that International Paper was the largest private landowner in the state of New York, and that they owned over 308,000 acres of both hardwood and softwood. These machines take the tree trunks and drop them into a canal, where they are hoisted into a building and are stripped of their bark.
They're on a break right now, so they're not dropping logs in.
The logs are cut into chips, and all bark is put into the burners as fuel, along with any chips that are not satisfactory for paper making.
We don't have a new boiler. We have two boilers.
Right.
One is a recovery boiler, and that utilizes recovered byproducts of the pulping process for fuel, so 100% renewable energy. And then our second boiler is a power boiler, and that currently utilizes number 6 fuel oil and bark.
So
And we are looking at substituting a small portion of the fuel oil with tire-derived fuel.
The chips are boiled at a very high temperature until they turn into a pulp. Then they are stored in one of 3 storage containers, one for hardwood, one for softwood, and one for a mix.
When you're operating power boilers or recovery boilers, the concern is for air emissions. And so those are equipped with pollution control devices to mitigate the air emissions.
So there is a limit on what's being put into the air.
Absolutely. There are permit limits that are in compliance with EPA and New York State DEC, Vermont Agency of Natural Resource regulations, and we operate well under our permit limits intentionally. I mean, we don't ever want to be in a position of even approaching our air permit limits, and we would not be during the trial or during the utilization of tire-derived fuel. We anticipate that overall emissions, with the introduction of a small portion of tire-derived fuel as a substitution for number 6 fuel oil, will show no increased emissions. In fact, we expect the emissions to be at neutral or even slightly less than they currently are.
So there's no change between the boiler you're using now and the boiler for tires? There's no difference in emissions? Or?
There is a slight difference in some components. We would anticipate that zinc oxide would show a slight increase. Zinc oxide is not listed as a hazardous air pollutant. However, nickel, which is a hazardous air pollutant, would go down because nickel is not a component in tire-derived fuel.